In May of 1971, Hot Rod magazine ran photos of an Oldsmobile engine that, on paper, did not exist. It was a 455, the same big block you could get in a station wagon. Except this one had 32 valves, 4 per cylinder, at a time when every other American V8 made do with 2. The magazine clocked it at 440 horsepower, and that was the mild version. By the time those photos hit the newsstands, Oldsmobile had already decided that nobody would ever be allowed to buy it. Now, Oldsmobile was not the company you would expect to be sitting on something like that. This was the brand your grandfather bought when he wanted to look well off without looking like he was trying. Quiet sedans, comfortable wagons, the car you parked at church. If you had walked into a dealership in Lansing, Michigan in 1969 and asked the salesman about a 32-valve engine, he would have looked at you like you had asked for a submarine. And yet, underneath all that beige, there was a fast streak that ran a lot deeper than the catalog let on. You have to understand what was going on inside Oldsmobile at the time. The division had this character it used in ads, a man in a lab coat called Dr. Oldsmobile, and he was the face of a whole line of high-performance parts. The parts wore a W. There was the W30, the wild one, the package that turned a 442 into a real street terror with a cold air hood and a hot cam. There was the W31, built around a smaller engine that loved to rev. There was the W34, the 400 horsepower version of the front-wheel drive Toronado, which is a sentence that should not make sense and somehow does. So the W codes already meant something to the people paying attention. They meant the engineers in Lansing had been let off the leash. The 442 had a following. The Toronado had won design awards and proved Oldsmobile could do something nobody else in America was doing. And it really was nobody else. When the Toronado arrived, it was the first American front-wheel drive car in decades, a big fancy two-door that sent all its power through the front wheels and somehow made it feel normal. That is not the kind of car a shy engineering team builds. It is the kind of car you build when the bosses have quietly decided that the safe answer is boring, and that boring carries its own risk. The W machine engines came out of the same instinct. This was a division that liked to build things just to find out whether it could. The W43 was the place where that habit went as far as it would ever go. Here is where the story usually gets told wrong, so let me slow down and get it right, because the truth is actually better than the legend. For years, people have called this the secret twin-cam Oldsmobile. The dual overhead cam monster GM was too scared to sell. And Oldsmobile did build test dual-cam engines in this same project, running them on test stands behind closed doors. That part is real. But the engine in those famous magazine photos, the one that survived, the one we can actually point to today, was not a twin cam at all. It was something stranger. The W43 started with a regular 455 rocket block, the same iron base under a lot of very plain Oldsmobiles. The engineers made the bottom end stronger with 4-bolt main caps, and they raised the camshaft an inch higher in the block to clean up the angles. One camshaft in the block. Push rods, like almost every other American V8 of the time. The trick was up top. Each cylinder got 4 valves instead of 2, and a single rocker setup opened them in pairs. 4 valves per cylinder. All 8 cylinders worth of breathing. All of it fed by a camshaft sitting right where you would expect to find it. If that sounds backwards, 4 valves and push rods at the same time, it is not. Big diesel engines have done it for decades. It just about never showed up in an American street car, which is exactly why it looked like something from another planet when the photos leaked. The intake valves measured 1 3/4 inches across. The chambers where the fuel burned had a shallow pent roof shape, the kind of design Cosworth was using to win races in Europe. People started calling it the Olds Hemi anyway, because the spark plug sat down in little tubes in the center of the valve covers, and it looked fancy. It was not a Hemi. The name just stuck because nobody had a better word for what they were looking at. And the famous pushrod engine was only one branch of the project. Oldsmobile also built an all-aluminum version of the same idea, lighter than the iron one, and the engineers ran their dual overhead cam tests right alongside it on the stands. So the legend of a twin-cam Oldsmobile is not made up. The company really was chasing it. The twist is that the engine which actually survived, the one that ran for the magazine and runs again today, was the clever pushrod design, not the dual cam. The most famous version of the story turned out to be the one nobody could prove. The truth was sitting in plain sight the whole time. And this is the part that still doesn't quite make sense when you say it out loud. The engineers got all of this working in 1969. To understand why that matters, you have to picture the rivals. The two most feared engines in America at that moment were the Chrysler 426 Hemi and the Ford Boss 429, legendary motors. Engines that built names that still stand today. And both of them, for all their power, breathed through 2 valves per cylinder. Pushrod, 2 valves. The whole car business was built that way. Oldsmobile, the church parking lot division, had quietly doubled the valve count while everyone else was still arguing about carburetors. Hot Rod tested it on a mild cam, with a set of 4 small Weber carburetors sitting on top, and it made 440 horsepower at a lazy 4,600 RPM. Mild. That word matters. The engine was barely awake at that number, breathing through a setup the engineers had chosen for smooth running instead of big power. The people who built it talked openly about how much more was in there. Whether the bigger numbers that got thrown around later were real or just hopeful is a fair question, and we will come back to it. But 440 horsepower, half asleep, in 1969, tells you everything about what this thing actually was. It helps to remember how slippery horsepower numbers were in those years. Car makers often fudged their numbers, sometimes up to look tough in the showroom, sometimes down to keep the insurance companies calm. The Chrysler Hemi was rated at 425 and tested higher on the dyno. The Boss 429 was rated lower than it really made, and built far higher than that for the racetrack. So when Oldsmobile said 440 on a soft tune, the honest take is that the printed number was the floor, not the ceiling. Nobody outside the building ever got to find out where the ceiling actually was. Now, the obvious question. If the engine was that good, and it clearly was, why have most people reading this never heard of it? The answer starts with the man whose name keeps coming up whenever Oldsmobile did something brave. Before we get into that, if you have made it this far and you are enjoying the deep cuts, the forgotten engines and the cars that almost were, do me a favor and subscribe. This channel lives on these stories, and the next one is already in the works. Enter John Belts. If you wanted to point at one person behind Oldsmobile being interesting in this era, it would be him. Belts came up through engineering. He was the driving force behind the Toronado, the big front-wheel drive coupe that gave the division a shine it badly needed. He understood horsepower. He understood the people who craved it. And by 1969, he had been made general manager of the whole division. The man who loved the wild stuff was now the man in charge. That is the kind of detail that decides whether a project like the W43 lives or dies. Rare engines like this do not survive on merit alone. They survive because someone with real power inside the building decides to protect them. Belts was that someone. As long as he was at the top of Oldsmobile, the 4-valve engine had a chance, however slim, of one day finding its way under a hood you could actually buy. But the world that engine was born into was already turning against it, and the turn was coming from several directions at once. The first push came from Washington. The Clean Air Act changes of 1970 set hard targets for cutting what came out of a tailpipe, and they did it fast. Almost overnight, the whole car business had to turn toward lower compression, unleaded fuel, and engines that ran clean instead of engines that ran hard. A complicated 32-valve monster was the opposite of where the rules were pointing. It was an answer to a question nobody in management was asking anymore. The second push came from the insurance companies. By the early 70s, they had figured out that young men and powerful engines were an expensive mix, and they started adding harsh extra fees to anything with real performance. The muscle car market that the W43 was built to rule was quietly being priced out of reach. You could build the fastest car in America, but if no one could afford to insure it, you had built a very expensive paperweight. The third push was the strangest, and it came from inside GM itself. There was an understanding, never written down anywhere you could point to, that the Corvette sat at the top of the company ladder. The Corvette was the top performance car, and divisions were not supposed to embarrass it. A 400-plus horsepower Oldsmobile that could climb well past that, with a few easy changes, was a problem with the bosses before it was ever a problem with the engineering. You did not let the sensible division build the fastest thing in the company. That was not how the game was played. And GM had a habit of doing exactly this. Years earlier, Pontiac had built its own rare overhead cam V8, a truly advanced engine, and the company had shut that one down too, caught up in a company-wide pullback from anything that looked like racing. The pattern was old. A brilliant idea would show up inside the wrong division, threaten the order of things, and get quietly buried before the public ever knew it existed. The W43 was walking straight into that same trap. There was one more problem, and it was the least flashy of all. The engine was expensive. 4 valve heads, cast and rethought, cost real money to build. And they added weight and bulk to a motor that was already a heavy big block. Even in a world with no smog laws and no insurance crisis, somebody in accounting would still have had to make the case for putting the most complicated engine in the company into a mid-priced Oldsmobile. That math was never going to be easy. So the W43 was already fighting uphill. And then, in May of 1972, the project lost the one man who might have carried it over the top. John Belts died of cancer. He was 46 years old. You can draw a fairly straight line from that loss to the end of the project. The one man fighting for it was gone. The rules were getting tighter. The market was shrinking. The inside politics were never going to bend. Whatever push the 4-valve engine still had, it did not survive the man who had been driving it. The final blow, if you can even call it a blow at that point, came in October of 1973, when an oil shortage sent gas prices through the roof and turned big, thirsty V8s into something close to a burden. By then, the W43 had been dead for a while. The oil crisis just made sure it stayed buried. And buried is the right word, because the engine did not disappear completely. A few were built, at least a couple still exist. For years, one of them sat on display at the R.E. Olds Transportation Museum in Lansing, Michigan, the city where the whole thing was dreamed up, where most of the people walking past it had no idea what they were looking at. Just an old engine on a stand. No little sign could really explain it. Which brings us to the strangest chapter of all, and it happened recently. There is one more piece of irony worth sitting with before we get there. By the time those hot rod photos reached the public in 1971, the engine they were praising was already finished as a project. The magazine was showing readers the future, and the future had already been canceled. Nobody reading it knew that. They saw a 32-valve Oldsmobile and figured, fairly, that it was a first look at something coming to a showroom. It was actually a goodbye that nobody knew was a goodbye. A while back, 2 brothers in Michigan, twins, came across a pile of old engine parts for sale. The asking price was $10,000. They talked it down and walked away with it for $5,000. What they had bought was a partial W43. It was missing a cylinder head. It was missing the intake, the valve parts, an exhaust manifold, and most of the paperwork that would have told them how it all went together. In other words, they had bought a puzzle with half the pieces gone and no picture on the box. So they rebuilt it from almost nothing. The missing cylinder head had to be made from scratch, cast again to match the one they had. They tracked down people who remembered the original project, including an old Oldsmobile engineer willing to help on the condition that his name stayed out of it. The whole thing went into a 1974 4.2, the car it always should have lived in. Then, in 2024, more than half a century after Oldsmobile walked away from it, they put the engine on a dyno. It made 560 horsepower. Now, I want to be straight with you about that number, because the story is full of figures that grew over the years. The 440 came from the first tests in the early 70s, mild cam, small carburetors. The 560 is a modern dyno result on the rebuilt engine, with a low redline and power still left in it. The men who built it said plainly that better carburetors and proper headers would have pushed it higher. Whether the wilder old claims, the 500 and 600 horsepower whispers were ever real, we cannot fully prove. But here is what is not in question. This engine, built when men were still landing on the moon, made 560 horsepower on a dyno using a single carburetor and a careful hand on the throttle. That is not a story about a hot rod. That is a story about how far ahead of its time this thing was. Because here is the part that I keep coming back to. Everything Oldsmobile was afraid to sell, GM built anyway. It just took about 20 years. In 1987, Oldsmobile itself launched the Quad 4, the first 4-valve engine America designed and built in big numbers. The same division that had hidden a 4-valve engine in 1969 was the one that finally brought the idea to the public, almost as if it had been waiting the whole time. In 1990, the Corvette finally got a 32-valve V8 of its own, the LT5, built with help from Lotus, the very kind of engine the company had once protected the Corvette from. By 1993, Cadillac had the North Star, and Ford had its 4.6-liter 4-cam. and within a few years the multi-valve V8 stopped being rare and started being normal. Today, you cannot buy a performance engine that does not breathe this way. Every one of those engines showed up to cheers. The W43 did the same thing first and showed up to silence because the company that built it made sure the public never got the chance to clap. The W43 was not wrong. It was early. Oldsmobile saw the future clearly, built a working piece of it, and then put it in a room because the world it lived in could not make the numbers add up. So think back to those magazine photos from 1971, the engine that supposedly did not exist. It existed. It ran. It made power that should have been impossible for its day. The only thing the photos got wrong was the ending, because everyone figured an engine that good would one day go on sale. It never did. Instead, it waited 50 years for two brothers and a borrowed memory to finally let it run the way it was always meant to. If you want to see another one of these, the great American engine that almost was, there is a video on the screen now about exactly that. Go watch it. I will see you in the next one.